Hey everyone, welcome back to Subscription Radio with your hosts Joel Van Horn and Ben Fisher.
AKA DJ Fish.
DJ Fish. Yeah, I'll start to introduce you that way. Sorry, my bad. So what are we excited about today?
Unite. I think that's
Shopify Unite.
Entire episode dedicated to talking about Shopify Unite. There were a bunch of interesting things that were said and I guess left unsaid. If you read people's sort of takes on Twitter and LinkedIn, there's been a lot of speculation about all the things that weren't mentioned. I know I have some opinions about that. Or I think they also, the demo example they had was building like a subscription app, which was interesting. Which again, I know that you and I both have strong opinions about that too.
Absolutely. Watching that for years and years, finally here, is it really as simple as they demoed it? I don't think so. Yeah. You're like, how's it going to charge them again? No, but it was to demonstrate a very basic use case that no store would actually be able to just use as that. But I appreciated the fact that it at least has people like us talking about it, because I got several text messages after that asking of like, wait, you can build a subscription integration in 5 minutes? And no more recharge? I can do it myself? Awesome.
Yeah. Like,
I mean, the thing is, clearly from this Unite, it's all very technical, right? Technical features they're rolling out. I'll be honest, I haven't watched Unite in a couple of years, but I guess it's kind of cool to see it on video at the same time. A little slow, but regardless, like there's only so much you can show, and if anything, it's an intro to the new technical capabilities. But I mean, building a subscription app is way more than setting up the app that you put in the App Store, right? Like they didn't get into the interface aspects of it, or at least very much. But I think the fact that they're highlighting subscription-related things is good in terms of encouraging people to start thinking about what they want to do in that area. At the same time, they kind of glossed over it. I would have thought that was a big deal, but it was just one of many other features, and they moved on very quickly. So I was a little surprised by that. I thought it'd be more highlighted. What else are you excited about that you saw?
Well, I'm excited. I'll work backwards from levels of excitement. I was very interested and surprised by hydrogen. I know it's still, from what I understand, more of a pet project of Toby's, and it's shipping later this year. I think at this point it's reasonable to be slightly skeptical because like there's certain features that have been announced at Unite for like 5 years in a row where they're like shipping, and you're like, okay, and then a year later it's like shipping. When?
It's interesting. Like that part of the demo actually caught my attention. I think it's mostly because I've been dealing with front-end development and how to not only build it in a scalable way, but host it and make it painless to make updates go up as quickly as possible and things like that. Using Next.js, for instance, hosted on Vercel. That's my context. It got me really excited that that's the type of architecture or infrastructure they're moving towards, because that's really what every developer wants. They just want it to be, a GitHub-based deployment, things like that, as well as ready-made components. Because I think, back when I was playing around with themes and so on using Liquid, that was, at the time, arguably innovative, maybe. But there was nothing out there that was like the standard official kind of example theme, which, by the way, they released Dawn now to kind of, I think they said it was their first one they ever released publicly as like an official theme. So it was surprising, right? Like this late in the game, 10 years later or whatever it's been. But, hey, better late than never.
Well, I think, and they've successfully leaned on the developer ecosystem to build a lot of their stuff, right? I think
Yeah.
the one big question I have was and is that it sounded like a lot of the features they released, where they referred to it as, was it Store 2.0 or Online Store
Yeah.
2.0, OS
Yep.
2.0, it is only compatible with, we'll call it, this new breed of themes, starting with
Yeah.
Dawn. And so the question I have is, well, does that mean that no store can incorporate most of the things that were just announced until they migrate their entire Shopify store to 2.0? My guess is that existing headless stores that implement Shopify, that'll actually not be that much of an issue, because they're probably not leveraging, they probably don't leverage their theme at all. But for everyone else, for people who are using existing themes or popular themes, my assumption is that the theme developer will release an update that makes it compatible with OS 2. But for anyone who has a bespoke theme, which again, I would say like the larger brands or anything that's been like really customized, hearing that, and like, on one hand, I got excited about everything, that a lot of things they were talking about. On the other hand, I was a bit like, well, what's that transition period look like for a brand? And who's going to do it? I'm sure they thought about it, but yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking about too. Is like, this is great technology. It can probably streamline the development experience, but this is for new stores, right?
Right.
And then, I haven't looked enough into all the different features, but like I was wondering if you could use some of those kind of new technologies for apps that then embed in certain places, or somehow create a hybrid theme or something like that. I mean, generally speaking, it sounds like no, but maybe some developers will come up with ways to actually slowly move parts of the site over or something along those lines. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. It's promising.
Unintended.
Yes, of course.
I think so hydrogen was the most, you asked me what was most exciting. I think that was the most exciting. Also had the biggest questions around, like, when is hydrogen going to be implemented? The change around, the more fundamental shift around OS 2 is very interesting and exciting. The question there is, what does that transition period involve and look like, and whatever. I think as a developer, the things that changed around like their tooling was cool, where there was a direct connection. Seems like a much tighter connection to like GitHub around deployment. That was actually a funny thing too around hydrogen, was it implemented Tailwind. It's using, they went all in.
That's great.
Yeah, they went all in on React Server components, and that they also offer Oxygen, which is their own hosting solution. You can also host it yourself, but again, it reminded me a little bit of, at least in the Laravel world, like Laravel Vapor.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So
it's promising that they have it all kind of together and cohesive and so on and so forth, but it also feels like starting from scratch, right? Going back to the whole theme development. If you want to leverage it, like, how much can you leverage it for what you already have? Did I get that right? Is the Oxygen hosting and everything based off of the online store 2.0?
No.
Is that all like one thing?
It's just, Oxygen is just for hydrogen.
Got it. And then React is highlighted too, right? So they're kind of presumably doubling down on React as the default framework. So I don't know if that's going to deter Vue developers or if they're going to switch over.
Yeah, I wondered about that too. I have no idea. I think
convenience, right? Convenience can make it pretty compelling to switch from Vue to React. Just saying.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, Ben and I have debated React versus Vue. I know React. I cannot read Vue, for that matter, and he looks at it the other way around. Him being a Laravel proponent.
Well, and I think for me too, it's, you and I come from different, we're both technical, but you are admittedly much deeper into the architectural scaling side of things, and I think that you've also had more time and opportunity to dig into React. I've always balanced the business side with engineering as well as product and design, and so it's been very difficult for me to create the time and space to really understand React, and the fact that like you have to deal with everything around the events life cycle and stuff and bindings. Like Vue is much simpler and more, and there's a less steep learning curve. Okay.
It looks much more like HTML, but we digress.
We digress.
That's for another episode.
Exactly. A couple other things that were really interesting. The platform apps API, for payments. The payments platform, where payment gateways as an app. I think I am still digging in to really understand what does that mean. Like, my assumption is that means that anyone, whether you're Affirm's a bad example because they have a native integration with Shopify, but like any of these fintech companies who are either doing things around like payment processing, they can offer their payment gateway by way of being an app. So like authorized.net support, I imagine, is now being supported through being an app, but I'm not 100% sure of that. What wasn't clear to me either was historically Shopify's had a policy that if you're using a third-party gateway, there's an additional processing tax if you're not using Shopify payments. And so I don't know if that's still true. And the conversations I've had with larger brands over the years has been like this idea of I think it's fairly rare that a brand can negotiate a better rate necessarily than what they would get with Shopify payments. I've certainly heard that, but if and when Shopify actually enforces their tax on payment processing, I don't know to what extent that makes it a moot issue, because you're adding 1% on top of maybe what you already negotiated was a 1%
right
preferred rate. So
exactly, net neutral. I was wondering the same thing, is if the current payment gateways are going to be converted into apps, or if those are going to be separate. Like things like Stripe, I forget, is Stripe allowed out of the box, or is that one of those things where they push you towards Shopify payments right now? I always forget what. Right. So
unless you're in a country that doesn't support Shopify payments.
Right. So I imagine if you wanted to create a Stripe payment app, they would just say, no, we won't approve that for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
But it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that layaway type of payment methods, that kind of stuff, I guess.
I think big picture, what it reinforced to me is that they are looking into, and they're committed to finding ways to enable payment processing. I think as a developer on Shopify, we all know that checkout, everything's related to checkout and payment processing have been more or less like, it's why I don't have any hair on the top of my head.
Too many years of trying to bend that to your will. I mean,
exactly.
I'll always plug my old article about how to do that from like 10 years ago that's still out there.
It's hilarious. You're the OG.
OG is right, yeah.
OG. And then, so the platform payments platform stuff is interesting, in part because it's talking a lot about like how to collect payment information. I don't know to what extent this means or impacts ways in which an app or a merchant can collect payment beyond, because up until this point, it's like if you offer a web experience, it has to go through Shopify's native checkout. I don't think that what they're doing is saying, oh, you can now host your own checkout page. That's like the opposite of what they want. So I'm not entirely sure exactly what that means.
We'll see.
So maybe I'll do some proper diligence, and if anyone listening has insight into that, DM me or email me or write me a letter.
postcard.
A postcard, yeah.
Any medium.
Any medium. I think so. The other things that were interesting, and maybe you would have more of an opinion on than me, was they announced the storefront cart API, and so like their use case was estimating totals, etc., ahead of checkout. I mean, you can already do that using draft orders, or using like the Ajax API. So there's storefront cart API and then the storefront API, which enables them now to do like they described it as like in context stuff where like you can say, hey, this person lives in the state of California, and because of that, we will do things like show a certain flag, or actually maybe the storefront API was international currency, where if your country's Canadian, you can change all the prices across the entire store to show Canadian. I think that was actually it. Sorry for...
Yeah, no, like I'll be honest, like the storefront and cart APIs are the ones I still got to dig into a little bit because it seemed very familiar, and I was trying to figure out kind of the nuanced differences now. But
yeah,
it does sound like you're able to calculate more things in certain places where maybe you weren't before, or you have more control over kind of customizing those calculations, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I'd be curious of your opinion on it. One thing that was clear was they doubled down on GraphQL as their API as opposed to REST, right? Like so, all of these new APIs leverage GraphQL heavily. I have experience, but it's limited. I think you've gone much deeper into the performance and all that stuff around GraphQL. Could you tell our loyal listeners what you think about this decision?
Sure. I mean, it's a hotly debated topic, right? Like, there's a lot of pros and cons to each solution, and one is not really better than the other. It's kind of what you're solving for. Like, for instance, the extreme version of GraphQL, when it really became something that was pushed to me, was with AWS. AWS is, a platform that does virtually everything. I mean, if you look at their menu, once you log in, there's probably 200 products that they sell, and you have no idea the difference between most of them. I pretty much stick still to like a handful of them and haven't really expanded too much beyond that because they've solved my problems for me. But because they have so many different microservices, GraphQL is a good solution to unify all those like physically separate endpoints into one endpoint where you can access the data across all those services in one place, right? So the way that they would have you set up GraphQL is this really complex configuration, kind of saying, okay, if they want to access, let's say, a user profile, it goes to this endpoint, it gets the data. If they want to access orders, it goes to some other endpoint behind the scenes to get that data. And so it's almost like in their context, it's like a reverse proxy, right? A reverse proxy is like one URL that will pull together things from 10 different URLs behind the scenes and make it seem like a really simple central place to access things. And so that's really like one way to think about it, particularly moving from REST to GraphQL. It's a way to access a lot of different endpoints, even in think of it like very technically in multiple threads, so you're doing parallel HTML or HTTP requests to return with one response, right? So that's one way to think of it, is a way to unify a lot of old endpoints into one centralized one. But then the other benefit too is from the client. That's really where I look at it from most, is the developer user experience or developer experience can be improved depending on how much data you're dealing with or what kind of client you're dealing with. When Facebook built this out, I believe it was because of their mobile apps, and a lot of mobile apps really like to optimize how much data is transferred so that if you're on cellular and things like that, you're not downloading too much data from an API. So what it lets you do is it lets you specify very specifically each data point, each attribute on like a customer. If you just want the name and the email, that's all you get back instead of 20 different attributes about a customer. So it really kind of simplifies the amount of data that comes across HTTP to optimize bandwidth, and then at the same time, rather than having to go to different endpoints, like to download the orders and to download the customer, you can get it all in one fell swoop to simplify that developer experience in terms of managing data within even like a web page, right? With React and Vue and so on and so forth. So for me, that's been the benefit, is it's less HTTP requests. You can also have easier caching of that data in the client. And then, if you want to change infrastructure behind the scenes, you can do that without affecting the API. And then one of the other things that's talked about a bit is versioning, API versioning, where with REST you typically have /v1 something else, /v2 something else. With GraphQL, the idea is theoretically, like I haven't really gone too much into it, but you just keep adding new fields to your existing API that represent the new data, right? I think they actually showed an example in Shopify Unite for the products. It was on their GraphQL API, it was products by handle, and they did an animation of fading it to just products. That's the new API endpoint, right? It looks like it's just an attribute, but really that's V2 of the API by renaming it to something else. Because now they'll have products by handle and products both side by side that get you similar or the same data. And if you still use it the old way or if you use it the new way, it should work for both cases. So that's an overly simplistic way of kind of describing it and kind of the reasons that I like it.
I think it's funny. It's like overly simplistic. Although if you were listening to that, it might be hard to follow along because it's not.
Well, you asked a very technical question, so I try to keep as brief as possible.
I learned a lot from that. It's just funny. It's like, well, that's like the simplification of it. You're like, what's the complicated version?
Yes. I mean, then you get into how do you load the data efficiently, and I won't get into it.
That was really interesting. No, but like that entire, I did not know a lot of the context around why GraphQL was even developed. So that makes complete sense.
There's gonna be a lot of haters who'll be like, that is not accurate at all. But hey, I would love to have any comments at the bottom of this podcast at this point.
I think that's an open invitation on Joel.
Trolls.
Nice job, Joel.
All right. What else do you want to know?
When I said we need to grow our audience, it's not what I meant.
Hey, at least we're not paying them.
Touché.
But yeah, I mean, I think since we're talking about GraphQL, like one of the things that I do think is annoying about Shopify's GraphQL API is some of the other features that exist, which are rate limiting, which is normal for APIs. That's making sure that you're not hitting the servers too much, bogging down the servers so that other brands or merchants who are using the same servers, have a slower experience. But there's also the quotas. So again, without getting into too much detail, theoretically, you can make one request to get like all the data from the entire database in one request. But to get all of that, there's a lot of processing happening behind the scenes to pull all that together and piece it together and then send it back to you. And so Shopify has a quota, meaning that they will only allow you to get a certain amount of data. And if you just ask for too much data, you'll get an error, right? And what's frustrating is it's really unclear at what point you're going to run into that error, because it's an algorithm calculating, okay, well, if you're going to get order data, it's worth 10 points, and if you get customer data, it's worth 2 points. So then you could get 1 million customers, but only 5 orders before hitting their error. I understand the thinking behind it, but to me, it implies two things. One is it defeats the purpose of trying to get all the data you need in one request, because now you have to make 2 requests. And 2, it seems to imply to me their infrastructure problems, whatever's happening behind the scenes, because they can't handle all that data that you might be requesting.
You can't handle all the data. You can't handle the truth.
Yes, exactly. So, I don't know, that's my theory, is that maybe they have, kind of like I described with AWS, they've got a lot of old endpoints that they're pulling together, and it's just inefficient to let you download too much at a time. So we'll see if those quota algorithms change. I have no idea how to keep track of that, but it'll be interesting to see.
I think we're coming up. We won't stop exactly in 20 seconds. We'll go a little bit over, but I was going to say one thing that we haven't talked about that we had alluded to at the beginning of the episode was going back to things that were not mentioned. And Shopify Plus is like one of the bigger things. I think what's interesting to me is a lot of the features that were rolled out or announcements, in my mind, address a lot of the concerns that I've heard from Shopify Plus merchants or merchants who are considering Shopify Plus. The general, I would summarize it as: at what point does my business outgrow Shopify? And at what point does my business outgrow Shopify Plus? And I think a lot of that, and a lot of the, we'll call it the attractiveness of headless and the headless ecosystem and headless as a solution, is this idea of being able to have full control over the storefront and like we'll call it the shopper experience without having to involve your engineering. I think that for a large brand, especially, like, that's naturally at a certain point, whether you're at $100 million a year in revenue or what, it's like it makes sense to make the investment, or it can make sense or seem attractive to make that investment. All the announcements they made around effectively changing, breaking up Shopify into the like CMS portion, like the content portion around meta fields, the hydrogen. Let's see what else. It feels like they broke everything that they talked about. Basically, broke up Shopify into effectively a headless and architecture infrastructure provided by one company. And so, for me, it did address a lot of at least for conversation, a lot of the concerns that a brand might have around what does the future look like on Shopify, and at what point might I have to either re-platform or not. It addresses that. The jury's still out because they haven't released a lot of stuff, and we haven't firsthand played with some of these solutions. But in theory, it does indicate. It does address Plus. Whether or not they'll call it Shopify Plus, I don't know. Maybe Plus itself will change as a actual offering, but Plus maybe would just be, I think Rick had written, I think his position was maybe that Plus itself would become more enterprise support focused, as opposed to like there being a clear differentiation or distinction between what functionality is available to Shopify merchants versus Shopify Plus merchants. Because there were a few things that's even around like script tags and stuff that previously only Shopify Plus merchants could do, including just like the general modifiability, customizability of the checkout page. That was a huge selling point of the Plus plan. Now that's kind of not moot, but less important, or less of a reason just to switch to pay a lot more money for your Shopify plan, because now they've added, checkout extensions, and as well as these other like embedded ways to modify the Shopify checkout, as well as like the general like storefront experience. So I think that even though Shopify or Plus didn't come up at Unite, everything I've heard about the market of Plus is that it's been like doubling in number of merchants. I do know that during the pandemic, Shopify's general, and if you look at at their like financial quarterly reporting and stuff, it's all in there. But Shopify as a platform grew enormously in the number of merchants on their platform during the pandemic. They grew, their Shopify Plus merchant base also grew substantially. It disproportionately, the entire platform grew disproportionately at the non-Plus. But that, if you have like a 900% increase in merchants, and you're, and only 20% of that growth is Plus, as opposed to maybe previously it'd been like they were having like 28% growth in Plus. 20% given the actual absolute numbers that Shopify has reported in growth, like that's still huge growth. So I don't know if anyone has any insight. I'm spending a fair amount of time just talking to people and trying to understand the dynamic around Plus. But even though it wasn't mentioned, I think Shopify very directly said that our platform is a place for large brands to come and stay, and they will be successful. And that we are continuing to, adjust the platform to reflect the needs of larger brands. So the question is, of the things that weren't mentioned, what does it mean for enterprise brands and for brands that are maybe on Shopify Plus, the larger brands?
Yeah, it is interesting that there wasn't too much targeting the plus merchants. I think the solutions that they're coming up with clearly are addressing a lot of issues and complaints, as well as trends that we've seen for quite some time. What's interesting is that a lot of them are being rolled out to everyone rather than just Plus, right? I don't know. Like, it makes me wonder if they're going to actually add more on the Plus side or not, right? I mean, you would think this would be the point where they announce that kind of a thing, but it's very curious because they're kind of starting to commoditize a lot of this stuff that could have been Plus only. Do you think that if all that functionality is available for non-Plus merchants, that Plus merchants would quote unquote downgrade? Because it's not like they're losing functionality, but I guess it just questions, or the question is whether the value of being a Plus merchant is still there, right?
Yeah, well, I think off the top of my head, a few things that are still only possible on Plus are, one of which is flows, which is the ability to generate, like, that's a huge, for brands who leverage flows, that's a huge selling point. API requests is another one. So if you're doing headless, Shopify Plus increases your API call limit substantially. And so if you're doing anything that relies on API calls to Shopify, it's possible that you might need to be on Plus just to be able to run your store the way that you want to. Shopify.
So it's almost like they're
also, I believe, still on Plus.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that they announced some improvements to, right? It's almost like they want to isolate the aspects that would cost you more as you scale, right? Like API limits, right? You need to upgrade to Plus because you need more bandwidth, you need more capacity. I think maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe they're just isolating it to, like, when you need to scale, you need to pay more. But until you scale, you don't need to pay as much. Just kind of like with the apps, in a sense, they're not going to charge a commission until your first $1 million, and then the commission is lower too. So, like, they're trying to make money once you hit some sort of scale. I don't know.
Yep.
It seems like the pattern.
Which actually reminds me that their big announcement around partners don't have to pay we'll call it Shopify tax, regardless of whether or not you're in the Shopify App Store. It previously had been, I think, 20% of your revenue, and now it's 0 for your first $1 million in revenue per year. So I think that, I mean, and that honestly, like, I don't get like warm fuzzy feelings all that often around some of the changes that Shopify announced. Oh, that one, I felt good.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, it's a good one. Getting a free $1 million. It's great.
Well, what you can actually think about it, though, is it's actually not a free $1 million. It is effectively a $250,000 investment in every Shopify app developer.
That's a good way to look at it.
Right? So they were taking 20%. Effectively, they're giving you back that 20%. And so maybe it's not $250,000, it's $200,000. It's a $200,000 investment, which eliminates friction for developing on their platform. And so I think it's just very smart. It also maybe will put some pressure on these other marketplaces, whether it's Apple. Well, Apple doesn't seem to listen to anyone.
Apple doesn't care, but I agree. Like, it could become one of those things that others want to adopt just to get growth. Right. get adoption in their ecosystem.
The other thing they didn't talk about, and then I'll shut up, is the Shopify audiences, which I think had leaked on Twitter, where the idea was effectively you could do targeting on Facebook based off of Shopify data.
Right. That's going to be interesting. I mean, you've got all sorts of issues right now trying to figure out how to target the right demographic and audience. So the more data sources you can tie together to cross-reference in a way that's not sketchy, theoretically, is definitely valuable right now. I mean, with iOS with 14.5, a lot of businesses went haywire with that update. So presumably that's the impetus for it, right?
Yeah, no, it is, and it was a very smart strategic move. And I think when you look at the announcements also of Shopify with partnerships with Google, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, it very much is like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Is that the expression? Or these companies are basically figuring out how to leverage their first party data to be able to continue to do. It gives them a lot more power too. I think the funny and weird part of things that I've learned about, even like a lot of this privacy stuff, is the people who benefit are the big companies, because they have all the data that they need, and they already have the network effects. What it does is it actually prevents a lot of competition. So, as well intentioned and positioned as protecting consumers as it is, and maybe it is, it's very
self-serving.
Self-serving, yeah.
And it diverts, the flows of where the data goes and how it's cross-referenced and so on and so forth, and adds more value to some platforms where maybe not others. So we'll see.
Cool. All right.
Awesome.
Well, this was another episode of Subscription Radio. Radio.
We should get .fm or something for that. But
I did get that.
Cool.
I just stopped telling you because I kept buying all these domains, and I got tired of you telling me to stop. So I did buy .fm.
I'm not surprised.
I know.
All right. Well, another episode in the can.
Bye-bye.
Happy 4th of July.